normal breakout session at the symposium. Hopefully you've had a fantastic day. I know we've had some terrific panelists, terrific speakers, terrific participants. And so this is the panel on corporate social responsibility and preventing human trafficking. So I want to make sure everyone's in the right place. My name is Stacy Grau. I'm a professor in the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Department in the Neely School of Business. And I'm also the director for the Idea Factory, which is out of our new School of Interdisciplinary Studies. And so I'll be moderating the panel today, and then we've got some great guests that will introduce themselves here in a little bit. But what I wanted to do, and what we all wanted to do when we talked about this, was actually start the conversation off with you all. And I want to pose a question to you that says, really, have you ever purchased something because a company you thought was doing good? How many? Give me a show of hands. That you bought something because the company that you purchased from you thought was doing good. Okay. Why did you do this? Why was this an important thing for you? Just give me some of the reasons. Yes.
Trust.
Okay. Okay. So you trusted. Yes. What else?
To financially support them.
Okay. So financially support the company. Okay. What else?
Cared about the issue that is.
Okay, cared about the issue, yes. I see lots of head nodding there. So the cause that they were supporting was really important. Anybody else?
Moral responsibility.
Okay, moral responsibility as a consumer. You felt like this was a good thing. Okay. So for years, companies have been providing, I guess, support to different causes, different nonprofit organizations in a variety of different ways. I've done some of my academic research on what we call cause-related marketing, where a company and a nonprofit organization basically ally, and that donation is then based on consumer purchases. But even prior to that, there were companies that would simply give money to causes. Many companies have set up foundations in which they sort of filter through some of their donations and other philanthropic endeavors there. We've got companies that allow their employees to do various sorts of volunteering, whether it's an all hands on deck kind of volunteering day, or whether it's something that they can choose to do on their own. More recently, we've had some interesting sort of integration of causes into their business model. So, buy one, give one. I know that's sort of a famous one that's been around. And then more and more we're seeing not so much just about telling that story to customers from a forward-facing perspective, but also what do they do on the back end? And so you're going to hear some of that today. So what I would like to do is I'm going to let my panel go ahead and introduce themselves, and I'm going to go ahead and pose the question to them. In what ways does your organization do good, and what does that mean to your organization? So Shubha, if you want to start on this.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Shubha, Chandra. I work at an organization called BSR. We're a global nonprofit consulting organization, and we work with over 250 companies all around the world on all aspects of sustainability. And here, when we talk about sustainability, some people are a little confused about the term corporate social responsibility and sustainability. The way that I think about sustainability is a quadruple bottom line. So looking at a company's long-term value in its financial, ethical, social, and environmental terms. And so what we do at BSR is we work with companies on topics like human rights. I sit on the human rights team and I'm based in our New York office. But we also look at topics like climate change, supply chain sustainability, women's empowerment, inclusive economy, and sustainability management, which looks at where does sustainability sit within a company. We work with companies in three ways. One is through consulting, which is one-on-one consulting with companies. Another is through research. And the third is through what we call collaborative initiatives. And so what I'm going to be speaking about a little later today is about one of the collaborative initiatives at BSR called the Global Business Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And we call it GBCAT just because the name is very long. And this is an organization that I'll speak a little bit more about it later, but it's really focused on working with the private sector to help address and prevent and address and mitigate human trafficking in their operations, both in their operations but also in their supply chains. And so when I think more holistically, and the question that was just posed is, what does your organization do or to promote good? I think for us, what's really important at BSR is really working with companies to help them understand that this isn't just about philanthropy. This is about ensuring that what they're doing is core to their business model, because as we've seen when a company is not doing well, sometimes the first thing to go is some of their philanthropic efforts. So how do we get companies to think about this as not just like, let's just make people feel good, but do something that's good for the business and good for society as well. And one thing that we've seen, and when we talk about trends later, we can touch upon this more, but we're seeing a lot of more consumer activism, and somebody just mentioned that you want to support a company that is a good person, a good organization within society. And that's what we're seeing more of, and so there's becoming more of an interest in companies being a good player in society and recognizing we don't operate in that. So our mission at BSR is really to create this just and sustainable world. That's our mission. So that's what we do on a daily basis.
Hi everyone, I'm Burson. I'm founder and CEO of an ethical fashion brand called Tribal Live. It's actually based right here in Fort Worth. And our focus, we're a brand rooted in meaningful employment. And our main mission is to employ women in parts of the world where they don't have access to opportunity. Women and girls around the world are held back at enormous numbers simply because of their gender. So our brand looks to close that gap and provide education opportunity and safe employment in parts of the world like Honduras, Guatemala, India, Haiti. Our main goal is to function and operate in a way where we respect the earth and the maker equally to the consumer. And what we see in the fashion world today are organizations and companies that have no regard for the earth and no regard for the maker. I think today a lot of the conversation has been around sex trafficking, and we were just discussing this, but I think what's missing from this conversation is labor trafficking, which we see all over the world. And most of us are probably wearing clothes today that were produced by people who were forced into labor. So we take our company, one, first to try to expose that fact and kind of the dirty secret of fashion in the way it looks today, but also to flip it on its head and do something different. So my background, I started in fashion. I worked in traditional fashion and design for a pretty big powerhouse brand and traveled all over the world and saw what factories looked like and saw what factory workers' lives looked like, and realized I was working in an industry that perpetuated poverty. So I wanted to create a brand that would actually work to alleviate poverty. So we focus on a few areas of business. Sustainability is one, and for us, that's focusing on the environment, where we source our product, our raw materials from, how the earth is considered in all of that. Labor is huge for us. We work on a fair trade and living wage model to make sure our work environments and the wages that we're paying our people are fair and in line with what the cost of living actually looks like in the countries that these people work in. And then we also focus on a lot of educational and life skill services for women that have never had a job or had education.
Hey everyone, I'm Noel Bouche, and pleasure to be with all of you on this great panel, part of this event. I'm on the panel because my best friend and spouse, Dr. Vanessa Bouche, told me to be on the panel. She said, "You're going on this panel." And I wouldn't have said that if she had just walked over. So, but I joked earlier on the other panel that I'm a recovering lawyer and a surviving nonprofit executive, and now kind of an accidental social entrepreneur. And that's what I'll talk a little bit about. I say accidental, but really providential. We co-founded a company called Savhera, which is a public benefit corporation marketing essential oils, organic essential oils in the U.S. market, while providing dignified employment for women exiting prostitution and trafficking situations in Delhi. And so we'll talk a little bit about that and what the structure looks like and how that came to be. But if I go back to kind of the personal origin story, it's actually, you're joking, in New York City reunion right up here right now. Vanessa and I were kind of introduced to the injustice of global sex trade going on 20 years ago in New York. And I still remember where I was. I was sitting on the 1-9, which is now the 1, I guess. But it was the 1-9 back then going uptown, and read a book that really opened our eyes to the injustice of not just trafficking persons, but specifically the global sex trade, and that kind of moved us on a trajectory of making a difference. And for us back then, we were young and passionate, had zeal, and we were going to go save the world. And how do you do that? You go get a degree, you go save the world, so law school. And we learned over the years, and I talked a little bit earlier about this, that it is not just breaking in brothel doors or freeing people up a labor trafficking situation. It is 1,000 small choices we make every day that cultivate justice around us. And we are all producers and consumers one way or another. And so those choices matter, and I think we've learned that over the years. The movement has learned that over the years. And we're seeing connections happen right now. This panel is going to dig into one of those with CSR. But it's been quite a journey using film and media, we talked about it earlier, to not only educate but transform our lives and open up our understanding collectively, not only what is but what can be, and move towards that. And that's been our journey at Savhera so far. An early stage startup that I can tell you, we talked about the challenges, but also the incredible things that have happened already. We've got a couple people in the room that really sell into that, so I might call them out later too. But really excited to talk about this topic broadly and also narrowly, and how all of us can play a role in, as consumers, getting behind organizations, businesses, for-profit or not-profit, that are doing good and driving change in these things.
Thank you. So as you can see, we are blessed to have several really strong panelists with us today. So, a lot of the things we've been talking about are pretty broad and can probably be applied to a lot of different causes. But we're here really to talk about human trafficking. So my question to the panel is, what is the connection between human trafficking and business? And just as you're kind of thinking through it, how do these issues arise? And maybe what are some of the unintended consequences that sort of happen between businesses and this cause of human trafficking? So I don't know, we're going to just go down the line, or if someone wants to jump in, it's totally up to you.
Well, I think businesses in a global world face tremendous challenges when it comes to ensuring that they're not perpetuating or contributing to trafficking. I can speak to labor trafficking specifically, but most brands and what capitalism really requires is that we're on this fast track to the cheapest price, the quickest manufactured product. So, and a lot of times these companies, in order to achieve fast, quicker, cheaper, they're manufacturing in countries that don't have really strong legal infrastructures or a strong, or really a weak government. So in countries where we see a lot of labor trafficking being perpetuated, it's in areas where there may be trafficking laws, but there's no infrastructure actually holding them accountable or enforce them. So for companies that are manufacturing and working in countries that can't help litigate and maintain some of these laws and these concerns, you have to really be diligent to make sure that you know exactly where your products are being sourced from, exactly where you're producing your products, who's being employed, what you're being paid. I know for my company we do really diligent audits, and I'm on the ground all the time working with our makers and our manufacturers to ensure safety, to ensure that the correct living wage is paid, but it takes a lot of work to ensure those things. And the bigger a company gets, the harder it is for them to be able to maintain that integrity. And we as a culture demand really cheap things, and we want trends really quickly. So society is, requiring that companies don't act ethically, specifically in fashion, when what we want is fast and cheap. And fast and cheap usually means that somebody's losing out or some part of the supply chain is being squeezed, and it's always the human factor that's squeezed in the supply chain. So I think it's really challenging to maintain ethics in this sort of capitalist business climate in America, but trends are changing for what consumers want companies to be responsible for.
Okay. So, in terms of the link between human trafficking and business, so to just pick up on what Carly just said, a lot of it is labor trafficking that we're talking about. For the most part, there is some sex trafficking, but a lot of it is labor, and it usually lies in the supply chains of companies. So what we do at GBCAT, we work with 8 companies: Coca-Cola, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Carlson, NXP, and an organization called, Caring, which is a luxury brand, and Boost Engagement, which is an SME. And we work with them we're looking at 3 different areas. One is what we think is part of the cause related to trafficking, which is poverty and actually sustainable employment. That was something that came up on an earlier panel, but you can't break the cycle of exploitation. Trafficking survivors are going to go back into that same cycle. And so what we're trying to do through GBCAT, one of the areas of our focus is working on trying to working with both labor and sex trafficking survivors to put them into sustainable jobs at companies some of the ones that I mentioned that we work with, but also within their supply chains. Because we feel like there is a huge opportunity for companies to take on survivors in these kind of more formal environments and provide them with an income that is going to be sustainable. We do recognize, though, that a lot of these companies, and companies generally, are ill-equipped to provide the type of environment where individuals who've suffered trauma can thrive. And so part of what we're also doing is trying to ensure that the companies that we work with develop this trauma-informed workplace before they can take on survivors. So that's kind of the way that we look at one of the causes that we see of trafficking. In terms of something that you may have seen in the press, there's been a lot of documentation around forced labor in Qatar and in the Middle East, and particularly involving migrants from Southeast Asia. And that's an example of labor trafficking, where you have individuals that are coming from one part of the world, they're being migrated to another part of the world for the purposes of work. And a lot of them are lured to these jobs because they're promised a really good pay, and the places where they live, they don't have those same opportunities of employment. So they're traveling to places where they think they can get employment. But the process by which they do it is generally through a labor broker or a recruitment agency, which takes money from them and essentially puts them in a situation where they're then bonded to a company and cannot leave until they pay off essentially the debt that they currently have. So that's kind of a situation that we see in real life here, and that's kind of what it means when you think about labor trafficking. That's just an example. That's an example of debt bondage, which is one type of labor.
I would just add, we have to recognize how integrated everything is and how they connect. I think it's a good segue to Dr. Bales tonight as he talks to us about, in his latest book especially, connecting not just sex and labor trafficking, but environmental degradation. We talk about fast fashion. Those go hand in hand. Our consumer desire for novelty and for continuous turnover and consumption drives exploitation, which drives incredible environmental degradation, the waste that's produced for our clothes. But they go hand in hand. And I think one thing Dr. Bales documents is in our supply chains, there's labor trafficking out, especially conflict minerals. I mean, none of us are holding a phone that is free of exploitation. And even companies like Fairphone and others, they said we can't even, we've set out to create one we can't. Create one that we know is free of slavery and exploitation. But around that, exists other forms. So, I mean, there's trafficking for sex around all these camps that are depleting the Amazon and cutting down the forest. So it's integrated, and I think one thing, just again, as consumers, we talk about all these elements, we have to look at through that lens. And look at the clothes I wear. How often do I need to buy something different, very genius? How can I adopt or reduce, reuse, recycle mentality? Can I look at my phone a little bit differently? Recognizing what goes into it. We talked about it earlier with media, that looking at porn or the sexual objectification of media connects to a demand for trafficking versus people being objectified. So everything you said is right. I'll tie it to our experience at Savhera. The cool thing about Savhera is I think a lot of our stories, we got leaders from all over the place. There's a particular catalytic moment at which that story began. In this case, it was Vanessa in India leading TCU students there listening to our NGO partners talk to a group of women who were on GB Road, trafficked as children, in bondage their whole lives because of the marginalization that happens then to them, and they're cut out of society. And a woman looked at her who had spent her life in the brothels and said, "Why should we talk to you? Why should we tell you our story? People come all the time, journalists, politicians, NGOs, to hear our story, and nothing ever changes for us." And the courageous response to that bold and courageous statement was, "How can we help you? How can we do something different?" And she said through the translator, "I want a job. I want dignified employment to get me out of this very business." And the amazing thing about that interaction was this unearthed in that moment was boldness, courage, talent, leadership. A person who, born in a different circumstance, might already be leading a company, might already be influencing. And it led to us Vanessa coming back, and our family and others around us making a commitment to say, we are going to commence something because there's nothing here, not to provide services, but to provide dignified employment. And around that has come everything you guys talked about, which is doing hard work as a startup, of making sure that we have staff in place as we hire to provide trauma-informed care and to develop them personally. I mean, as a quick story, we're going to be labeling, packaging, and retailing here in the U.S. our own brand of essential oils because we found not only a social need and that desired social outcome, but a market need. It's not a brand option here in the U.S. in the booming essential oil market. So we're going to tap into that. We spent the first few months really working on personal development. We're coming out of a place where not only were the trafficked children illiterate, but not even able to hold a pencil because they never had done so. Taught to do that. And that's one of the benefits. We'll come back to forming as a public benefit corporation, which is maybe one of the trends we talk about CSR, but a new corporate structure that allows us to do that. And we'll talk more about it, but it's kind of think hybrid nonprofit for-profit. You know, a social outcome that is driven and funded not by grants and donations, but by a for-profit model where we will operate as a profitable company and yet be able to provide the social outcome. In this case, the professional, social, personal development of women who want dignified employment. So there's a quick summary of a few different topics.
At this point, I want to ask you all. We have additional questions, obviously, for the panel, but I want to make sure that you're also able to ask questions of the panel thus far from what you've heard. So does anyone have any comments or questions that they'd like to? Yes.
This might be something we could just Google, but how do we find out where our clothes are coming from with brands that we shop? Or, is that something we can just look up online?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So there are websites that you can go to that will list brands that are recommended as sustainable or ethical. The most important thing to look for is how transparent are brands on their websites. Like, do they talk about where they're producing? Do they talk about things like sustainability, transparency, workers' rights? And most of the time, if they're not talking about those things openly and you can't find that in their marketing strategy, then it's not a place that you want to shop. What's dangerous right now is that ethical fashion is a buzzword. So it's becoming something that consumers are looking for and wanting to engage in, which is awesome. Like the fact that shopping trends are changing and that this younger generation is caring more about where their products come from is great. So some companies are making shifts to be more responsible and take care of the maker and take care of the earth. But what most companies are doing are using it as a marketing tactic. So they'll say things like sustainability, transparency, ethical manufacturing. I mean, a brand that I used to work for just came out with fair trade denim, and it's not fair trade at all. There's new certifications now that allow companies to claim that they're fair trade, but it's an easy certification that doesn't really require any follow-up. So it's actually a really hard thing. So the only thing the first thing that I can say is refuse to engage in fast fashion. The Forever 21s, the H&Ms, the Zara's, I mean, they are causing poverty, exploitation, and trafficking all over the world, so start there. And then I would say start researching different ethical companies. There's it's a good, better, best scale, and there's no perfect answer. But I email customer service organizations all the time for companies that I might want to engage in shopping, and I'll ask them questions about where their products come from, what their supply chain looks like, if they can speak to me about their labor practices, and if they can't answer those questions, then I won't engage in shopping with them. So you just have to start somewhere. It's hard, and I try to have a completely sustainable closet, and then there are things that I own that I know weren't responsibly made. So I think what people need to feel like they can engage, that it's not impossible. It can be small, slow changes. And if you just start asking their questions and caring about the answers, that's the place to start.
And then I can just add that the companies take note of those questions because we work with sustainability teams, legal teams, companies, investor relations. those are the questions that they then, like that helps them build the internal buy-in to work on those topics to make sure that they're more transparent and listing, for example, the factories in which they work, or that they're supplying from, things like that. So those questions actually really make a difference.
Absolutely.
That's a great point. I was just going to say that, you know, one thing we have to protect against, and everyone in this room, by virtue of being here and probably being in the fight, as it were, knows, is we need to have vision and be patient and do what we can. Otherwise, we will despair. These are global injustices that predate all of us, and we have to do what we can. And that was a great statement that everything we do and can do does matter. You know, we can't opt out of the system fully. Some people try, most of us can't, and we have to recognize that and say, where can we make decisions that are different? Because they are being noted. It doesn't feel like they are, but we're being watched every second and listened to. So we have to have faith that, again, these 1,000 small choices matter, the purchases matter, the way I vote matters, what I say and don't say on social media matters, and that can, I think, sustain us because we can't just take a sledgehammer to the system, individually or even everybody in this room. We do exist in a system, but how over time can we make changes to it, innovate, and we said earlier in another panel, it's less like a machine than a garden. I mean, we truly are, justice is cultivated, and we have to be in there cultivating the soil, watering, picking the weeds. Where are the weeds? Man, I was at H&M again last week. Well, maybe I should stop. There's a weed that we just picked, and that not only helps us, it does, like Shubha said, make a difference. It's noted, and that drives you.
So I think the panelists have really brought up an interesting issue about impact. You know, at the end of the day, what does success look like? And you know, we all know, and research says that really being able to measure a lot of this social impact, and it's really quite difficult. And again, depending where you are, and depending on what kind of business you are, what success looks like may differ. And I think to Noel's point, a lot of times it's you got to start somewhere. So my question is, you know, what does success look like for your organization, and what are some of the barriers that you see to achieving that? What's out there that's making that a little bit more difficult?
So I think success would look like businesses focusing more on long-term financial profits, so not short-termism, which is what we see in the markets today. And particularly on human rights and labor issues, it's really hard to quantify the amount of money you would save if someone did not die, if someone did not get injured, things like that. Those are a lot more difficult than, for example, the amount of money you would save by reducing the amount of paper that you use in your office, right? So the cost of people is really hard. And you know, similar to what Noel and Carly mentioned about being really conscious in your decisions, that same long-term thinking is what we think consumers should also have, right? So, like you said, not kind of giving it to fast fashion and buying maybe better quality and more expensive things, but fewer numbers of those. And so, just thinking, you know, going back to business, we really would love to see more companies looking at sustainability as something that is core to their business, not something that's just in one department, but is streamlined within the organization. So you have buy-in from legal, you have buy-in from the C-suite, which is essential for sustainability to be really within the ethos of a company. But then you have procurement that's thinking about these issues. You have PR that's thinking about these issues, not just from the PR standpoint, but because they realize that this is an important thing they need to be caring about. And that you have companies where the left hand and the right hand talk, right? Not that the PR department is doing one really great thing, building well somewhere else, and then one other part of the company is abusing the rights of workers elsewhere, right? That's what we see a lot. And so ideally, an organization like BSR or other organizations would cease to exist if we didn't have these problems, right? There would be no need for our service. But because companies are still wrestling with these issues, and frankly, they're very challenging issues because the companies we work with are global companies. They employ hundreds of thousands of people. So in an ideal world, it would be that these companies think about the world holistically, recognize that they do not operate in a vacuum, and that everything they do, all the people they touch, makes an impact. Whether it's their suppliers, whether it's their consumers, whether it's their employees, whether it's their contractors. Everyone, this is a web, and it's really important that companies think like that.
For us, impact is measured in many different ways. I mean, we're a social enterprise, we're a business, so the more money we make and the higher our revenue, the larger impact that we can have. So we operate in a model of believing in business and believing in impacts. Businesses impact to do good and to initiate change. But truthfully, our main mission is in employing women and increasing the rates of job opportunities for women in countries where, our first co-op started in Honduras, and the documented unemployment rate there was 70%. And most people in Honduras are undocumented, so it's actually probably higher than that. And they believe that 3% of women are employed in Honduras. So we started with a co-op of 2 or 3 women. We now sustainably employ 40 women. At the time when we started employing these women, only 5% of them were able to afford to send their kids to school, and now 100% of them have their children in school. So for us, the impact is really in being a part of changing the face of poverty for women and girls all over the world, and that's what we're in this thing for. It's 70% of the world's most poorest people are women. So women is a feminist issue. So it's a women's issue, and we want to see those numbers change. So we really base it off of employment numbers, looking at educating this generation, but are we employing the next? So the numbers of girls and daughters and sons that are being educated in families, because that's maybe where the cycle of poverty will break. Our women will always live in poverty, we're too late. So their lives will always be poverty stricken. They can now afford to feed their children, send them to school, provide for the basic needs. But the only way to start to break the cycle is if we meaningfully employ these makers all over the world who are brilliant and strong and resilient and have these incredible skill sets to tap into, so that they can then educate their children, and then that generation starts to change things. So for us, impact is seeing how the cycle of poverty starts to be broken in families all over the world.
That's great. Success looks similar for us. A couple things that came up. I think the short-termism is a big issue, and that, again, is kind of a systemic one. It's one that I'll mention here in a sec. This new structure of being a public benefit corporation helps get at, because right now the system is such that you're pressured into that. It is about, A, your fiduciary duty to maximize returns, and to do that as quickly as possible in the short term. And so that's a pressure that many businesses, especially publicly traded companies, obviously are up against. And that's why we should support the ones that are doing things in whatever space, whatever silo of corporate social responsibility there are. As my friend George is in the room, and I'm thinking of Savhera up the road, and a number of years ago launched the Passport to Freedom, and that's an example of how they recognize their industry bumps up against human trafficking in the travel and tourism industry, and led incredibly in terms of thought leadership, and then also putting a code of conduct in place. And those are things that can happen. And then for small social enterprises, we have basically, as a for-profit social enterprise, we have 2 goals. It's in our charter. The first one is to be profitable where you won't exist, but equal with that, and actually the origin story and primary goal is, in our case, to create dignified employment for women exiting prostitution, which means poverty, which means a cycle, which bumps up against our big topic about prevention, which is the way that happens is we're preventing the next generation from falling into the same traps, the same vulnerabilities, while providing right now restoration for a generation. And that's been interesting for us. There's a lot of efforts that go towards children and rescue of domestic, here, minors and across the world, and that's important. We found, working with women who are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s who were trafficked as children but now live in the slums and brothels, have no escape and have no skills, to see them come alive, to see them change, to see them finally living in a place where they are producing, learning, having dignity with uniforms and badges, and the life that's coming out of that. That's part of our model, is moving them up through management and into employee ownership as we get going further down the road. Those are the things that break those cycles, and that's exciting.
So I know one of the things that I've read a lot about is that really there's a lot of different perspectives on this from business leaders, and so there are some, especially those that are publicly traded companies, where there are people within those companies that don't feel like this is something that they should do because these are shareholder dollars. On the other hand, you've got companies that look at it a different way. I was reading recently the CEO of BlackRock, which is one of the largest private equity hedge fund companies with something like $6 trillion under sort of management, and he actually had some backlash because he actually was a proponent for many of the things that our panelists talked about. So this is a really hot area. I think a hot area for companies. This idea of nonprofits and even social enterprises really doing some amazing things. So what are some of the trends and some of the innovations that you guys have seen in terms of corporate social responsibility? And like, what is the difference between really walking the walk and talking the talk? This idea of sort of the marketing piece of it and showing this glowing reputation for the company versus when you sort of peel back some of those layers, maybe they're not quite following some of these responsible business practices. So thoughts on innovations and trends and that sort of, dichotomy.
So I think with the rise of social media technology, it's really hard for companies to hide when they're doing not so good things in other parts of the world. So I think that's one trend that we see. We also see similarly increased transparency through technology like blockchain, which is essentially an electronic ledger. So you can see where transactions or who they're going to. So that helps with, I think, with transparency. I mentioned this before, but consumer activism. You have more individuals that are taking stances for the brands that they like. And that's also changing the way that companies are thinking about it because they're trying to appeal to groups like millennials. There are a lot of studies that have shown that millennials want to buy and they want to work for principled and ethical companies. And so that's something that, even if companies don't necessarily think that way, they're having to think that way in order to attract talent. And then lastly, and particularly in the US, you've seen a lot of companies take stances on issues historically they might not have taken stances on. So particularly when you see the US government shirking its own responsibilities and rolling back legislation and regulations. And so, one example is the immigration ban. And you saw a lot of tech companies that came out and said, no, this is actually a huge problem because we employ a lot of people that are here on immigration visas, right? They're here, they maybe have an H-1B, and that's why they're able to leave this country. And if they come out, they leave the country, they won't be able to get back in. So this is actually really bad for our business. So we're going to tell you, and we're going to come together as an industry and tell you this is a problem for us. You also see more specific companies that have come up and taken stances like on, for example, Black Lives Matter. So that takes a lot for a company to do because they realize that they're going to alienate some people, that they're also going to attract some others. So I think it's been a really interesting place to be where you're looking at companies that are I think taking stances particularly on social issues. I think there are companies that have historically been advocating for more environmental issues like climate change, or Patagonia has been really focused on our national parks and that kind of stuff. So I think the social issues part is really fascinating, personally for me, because I work on human rights issues. But those are just some of the innovations and trends I've seen.
I think what's been great to see is that the idea of being ethical or sustainable is really evolving. I think, the easiest example of where we all saw this sort of start was in Tom's 1-for-1 model. But what we learned later into the game is that this 1-for-1 model wasn't really actually good for the world. It was, us as consumers buying a $60 pair of shoes and a kid in Haiti receiving a pair of shoes that was made in a factory in China for $1, and then local shoemakers being put out of business in Haiti because these shoes were being given away. So I think what the industry recognizes is that we all start from a place of wanting to do good when it comes to social enterprises or sustainable businesses, but that we really have to constantly evolve and grow. And I know at our company, it's our goal is that every day we're impacting another side of the supply chain. We started focusing mainly on, so I think what we're seeing is more of a holistical approach. It's not just labor, it's not just the environment, it's not just the supply chain, it should be everything, all encompassing. So for us, we started with fair wages, labor, safe work environments, and then we started really looking into where our materials coming from. I mean, there might be a company that you're buying from that says that they employ women fairly, but does their packaging come from China? Does that, does that packaging harm somebody in China? Or, my jewelry, we originally were sourcing our jewelry and couldn't trace exactly where the original base metal was coming from, so we had to completely change where we were sourcing it from. And then our thread in Guatemala, they couldn't trace the farmer that the original cotton was coming from. So we moved to a completely upcycled model. So in the beginning, we weren't doing everything perfectly, just like I think those companies who want to do that, they're not doing everything perfectly, but it's constantly trying to move and evolve towards better in all areas of the supply chain. And I think that because of activism, because of social media, because of, thank God, a younger generation of progressive thinkers, we're being pushed to really think about what we do, and we're being held accountable for what we do. Because all areas of business need to be looked at, because if it's just one side of the business, another side of the business is not going to somebody. So I think the holistical approach and society's demands for that has been really refreshing to see.
And leaders with demands on themselves for excellence and growth and innovation. Like, how encouraging is that? They had this great company, but they weren't perfect at the beginning. And I think that's what it requires: constant innovation, constant improvement. And that's any startup. That's any new venture, any new enterprise. I mean, Reid Hoffman, says any startup is like flying an airplane, building it on the way down after you come off the cliff, and that's what it feels like. And I think that's encouraging for all of us as we begin anew. Also, just with CSR, it's just encouraging to me that there is growth, that there's change and innovation in it. I mean, you can go way back, but I look back to the end of the 19th century, and you start to see the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts, you start to see this philanthropy starting after these massive fortunes were built up by these monopolists. But, they came out of that first wave. We have Vanderbilt University, Carnegie Hall, and all these things. And over the 20th century, also more to, really looking at business ethics, and then other ways that we can grow, and then just corporate giving, which has been maybe the most used form of CSR. Just, hey, look what we give to. We do all this stuff, don't look at the supply chain, but we give to all these nonprofits over here. So, don't look behind the curtain. But that's evolved too, to where now, it's not just giving, it's not just corporate volunteer days, it's how we structure the business. And that's what I kind of get most stoked about. And that's why, again, we're in the midst of it right now as a startup public benefit corporation, which is different. I'll back up for a second from the B Corporation. We get some spirited emails about this because it is the difference between third-party certifying groups. Certification is one, fair trade, B Corp. But something like a public benefit corporation, which is brand new in Texas, and now over 30 states have passed legislation for this form of business. But a benefit corporation basically takes the edge off, first of all, of the short-term business, because it says you are committed to a social outcome as well as a return on the investment. In other words, it's not just maximizing the shareholder's return, which allows you then to make business decisions and say, we're actually, and go to investors who you're going to say, guess what? You have to see a return. Like, you will see a return, or this is not going to be a sustainable, ongoing enterprise after a while. But we're going to do things that aren't going to be as efficient as this is because we have the social outcome. In our case, we hired before, if we were, we were a public benefit corporation, we wouldn't have, 6 employees in Delhi right now because we're still pre-revenue and are ramping up to our e-commerce site in a couple of months, which late spring, everyone can look for Savhera.com. USDA certified organic oil. But that's exciting to me because that's a structural shift. Now all of a sudden we can run a business that we're not going to face a shareholder revolt and lawsuits because of our business decisions on that social outcome. And also it's baked in the transparency that we're talking about and the reporting on that. So it's great, and I know, I'm a lawyer, I'm geeking out on this, but I think that's kind of the next step of creating what we want to see and using, as ELAB says, business as a force for good. Which, if I could, my hope at kind of being in this space now as an early stage startup is that this would be transformative over time in our society. I mean, profit is not a bad thing. Greed is a bad thing. Gordon Gekko would say greed is good, but we're now not in the 1980s anymore. We're in 2019 where we have all these things happening in society. And we have to recognize, how are we going to fund the change? And how are we going to think about business? know, like for me, like, you know, I think about business and then nonprofits. Well, technically, there's for-profit businesses and nonprofit business. Technically. It's all commerce. And that's been a change for me, having been in the nonprofit sector for the last 10 years, and, you know, still going after donors, building donor relationships, and getting charitable gifts throughout the year. It's great. You have to cultivate that, just like you do with investors. The difference is we've raised investors in the seed round for this company, is it does demand a little bit more. Now, I'll be honest, I mean, raising money is hard in any context, but the thing about donors, a donor gives and they're done. And they've already gotten their return on that investment because they got the tax deduction. It's a pretty good return right away. You make a $20,000 donation, a major donation or something, you got that return. But, you know, you raise up investors who are investing in your startup. And even as we put in an investment document that, hey, you know, we're going to retain earnings, invest in growth, here's where it's going, we'll see a return, here's our projections. Well, they're with you. And that demands a certain level of, I don't want to say excellence, you need to be excellent in every sector. But there's, it's pushing again against the short-term wisdom that I've experienced in other places. So I think that's been good for, I mean, just, I'm speaking from my experience, really encouraging to see the growth and the trends, but then also how there's so much opportunity here. And, you know, we're just on the cusp, I think, on that next piece. But it's work like this that is blazing new trails.
Well, I also think this is, it sort of brings a good segue too, is a lot of this requires a certain amount of passion and, you know, in some instances, sacrifice. And I think if you talk to most social entrepreneurs, they've come to this place based on some story. And a lot of times these stories are fantastic, and that's sort of what they stick to, kind of help us stick in our heads. If anyone wants to share their story as, you know, what was the catalyst? I know, Noel, you mentioned it a little bit, but if you even want to expand on that, you know, what was the catalyst, that sort of, that big aha that says, I have to do something, like this can't just stick the way that it is?
My wife came back from India and said, we have to do something. So,
She's bossy like that.
so I had to do something.
Everyone knows it.
No, she said that, and I looked across the dinner table with my two daughters and said, we have to do something. And, you know, those are moments you don't forget. You don't forget moments like that. Many of us have had those in this room, of looking someone in the eye, or having that moment where there was and I'll just say on that, we talked earlier today, but just the patience and perseverance to keep cultivating. Because there are people who are looking at right now, like, you don't get it. You don't get your privilege. You don't get how you're objectified. You don't get the microaggressions. You don't get this. You know, but even with that, we have to be patient and persevere. This was in the media panel, we were saying, I think all the messages that are grooming for toxic masculinity, that are grooming us for acceptance and apathy, we have to be patient and persevering in looking people in the eye who might seem like they're on the other side of the table, or the other side of the aisle, or the other side of whatever, and keep putting this in front of them, because we have to believe there will be that aha moment, there will be that turning point. And I can look at people in the room right now, they've had that impact on me, so that's, for me, the very important.
Okay. Carly, what about you?
Well, I mean, my story really started on a personal level when my husband and I were finalizing my daughter's adoption. She's originally from Ethiopia, and her birth mother was young. She was HIV positive. She was on the streets, and she was engaged in prostitution and didn't have any means to be able to keep her child. And I think when my whole life I've always wanted to adopt. I never desired to have biological children. And I thought that I knew everything about adoption. But in that moment of, you know, adopting, Ellie being in Ethiopia, being in the orphanage and witnessing birth parents coming to visit their children during visiting hours, and just recognizing the poverty being the main cause of child relinquishment all over the world. And I recognized my own life and how I was causing that poverty, how I was working in an industry that caused poverty for women all over the world, and just couldn't. I cry every time I tell my daughter's story. I've told it 100 times, so I just cry. I apologize. And I just realized that I had to do something that would let her know that her birth mother mattered as much as I did. So I came home and I told my husband, similar to your guys' story, I said I have to do something. I can't go back to this job and continue to work in an industry that is harmful to women. And he said, so do something. So, you know, for us, it's like here I am 4 or 5 years later, and I I now have a 7-year-old daughter, Ellie, and I have a 19-year-old daughter. She's a refugee from Guatemala, and she has a daughter, so I'm a grandmother. So just being, connecting my story through motherhood, now connecting with just women all over the world and recognizing there's just no difference between us. There's the only reason that I wasn't Ellie's mom in Ethiopia, unable to keep her, is simply because of where I was born, because of the color of my skin, because of my privilege, who my parents were. So I think for me, it was just this realization of what it actually means to be a global citizen, what our responsibility is as humans. And it's a really great big responsibility and a great big burden. And I never stop working, I never really sleep, I never not feel the weight of the world in these women, but I think it's the greatest privilege of my life to feel connected like that with women all over the world.
Well, that's hard.
I know, it's hard.
So my path is a little different. So let's see, after I graduated from college, I went to school in DC. I worked for a law firm where part of what I was doing was working on international human rights cases against multinationals, particularly extractive companies. And I thought it was great. I was really convinced that big business was horrible, and they were doing all these bad things, and I felt like this was one avenue that we could use to fight big business and change their behavior. I worked for a couple of NGOs. I spent some time abroad. I went to law school, graduated, and through that entire process, what I learned, having spent some time working at these NGOs and doing advocacy work, was that a lot of the work that I was helping with was following the deaf ears of the U.S. government, and that there are a lot of reasons why the government wasn't really going to take action on the issues that I cared the most about. And I started, this is around the same time that a set of principles called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights came out. And one of the pillars of the guiding principles is focused on corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And part of that includes developing a policy statement, conducting human rights due diligence, and then also remedying human rights abuses when your company has caused or contributed to it. And so to me, that was a really interesting turning point because I was a little disenchanted by the advocacy movement and the NGO movement, and I thought that there's an opportunity to work closely with business to help them, really to educate them and help them see why it's good to think about human rights as not just a feel-good exercise, but something that's good for their business. And so prior to this job at PSR, I used to work for the UN out there. They have this corporate sustainability mission called the Global Compact. And so I used to manage their business and human rights program, and also worked as their legal counsel under our chief legal officer. So also a retired lawyer, hopefully actually trying to get back into that somewhere.
Retired is one thing. Are you recovering?
I'm not working. No, I'm great. I was happy. But and so I guess it was a little bit of a different journey where I knew I always wanted to work on human rights issues. I got into it thinking about more the conflict-affected countries in which where human rights violations were taking place, because that's actually a lot of what I hear about. And actually thinking about one of Carly's points, I'm Indian, and I always think about how you don't get to choose where your parents are and where you're born. And I always felt like I could be any of those people in any parts of the world that were, any developing part of the world, and that have the same opportunities that I have now. And so, yeah, it's a little bit of a circle, and I've now kind of come to the other side where I'm engaging with business in a constructive way. And a lot of the people I talk to are really passionate. The individuals at these companies really care about these issues. They're their kind of corporate change makers. They're the advocates that are really the champions on these issues. And so it's really exciting because you're working with somebody who's really a partner. And it's been, great. I love this field. I think anyone that's interested in getting involved in it should really do so, because we need more help.
So, audience, I'm sure you've got some questions or comments for our panel. Yes, ma'am.